Not only Ken and Kim, but I know Casey and I have talked, and he's reached out as well, and so and a bunch of other folks, and so the Longs, and we appreciate just everybody having us in, and it's great to be here in Kansas. Amen. And there's something rock chalk something like that, right? Yeah. We don't use that kind of language where I'm from, but so from Wisconsin. So I live in Minnesota, but that's just where I go to bed at night. I'm from Wisconsin. So did I hear Badgers? Did I hear Go Badgers? That's right. All right, there you go. So we are here, and it's great to be here, and we look forward to it. We don't have all the answers and don't pretend to be. This is it's a difficult topic, subject, but it's good to get the conversation going. And that's really what we want to do. We want to share our perspective. And in the first session, we're going to really we're going to focus sort of internally on churches and what can happen within our church fellowship and churches internally, and some of the things that can cause problems there. Satan is always trying to divide in one way or the other. And so we're going to talk about sort of the internal element. And then in the second session, we're going to turn our eye outside and look a little bit at the global picture, the divisions and the issues in the world, so that we know sort of what's going on and the perspectives that are out there. And then we'll finish that off and say, what does it look like when the kingdom responds to those divisions and issues? Does that make sense? Okay? Very good. So I want to tell a little story, if we can begin. Do I have the PowerPoint, or is that coming up?
I can get it for you.
Oh, sorry, we miscommunicated there. I thought it was up. So it'll be a minute. That's fine, no problem. That was my fault. But I want to tell you a story as we start out. And it's a bit of a conglomeration. There it is. Okay, amen. So we need someone to run that, is that right? Or a clicker? All right, well, we're taking care of those slight technical difficulties, which I will take the blame for. Because Kevin asked me, are we all set with the PowerPoint? I'm like, yeah, I'm sure we're all set. But we clearly weren't. So, okay, there's my family. There you go. We'll start with that before I get to my story. That's my wife, Lucretia. She's over here. She'll be talking in a little bit. And then on the left here is our oldest son, Paviel. He's 22, and he's back in Minnesota right now. We have a 17-year-old nephew that lives with us as well. And then on the right is our youngest son. Thank you. He is 14 now. This picture was taken about a year ago, and he's a good inch taller than me now. So they're back at home, and they always have two standards when we leave the home: don't burn the house down and don't kill the dog. And that's our expectations. They're not high, and they usually meet them. So there we go. So I want to give you a story that's a bit of historical fiction, but it's kind of rooted in some truth, and just see if some of the things sound familiar. And I'm going to warn you right up front that as we talk throughout the day, I'm just sort of blunt, and I say things the way they are. So if you get offended, sorry, you can talk to me later, and I'll promise I'll listen. But I just kind of say things straight out, okay? So imagine a summer camp. You all have summer camp here for the teens, right? And imagine a scenario where the kids all come in and they start rolling into the summer camp, and the bus and the cars drop them off, and they're all excited, and they go to a main building to get their cabin assignments, okay? And you're down in this cabin, and so all the boys start getting their cabin assignments, and they run down to this big cabin where they're going to be. But they're told, once you get down there, find your bed, slide your gear and your stuff underneath the bed, and get ready for the swim test or whatever that's coming up, and be prepared, right? So you go down there, and imagine that you're a counselor, you're a young campus guy or whatever. And you go down there and you walk in, And much to your surprise, a group of teenage boys has not followed the directions exactly as given. Now, I said this was fiction, so I know that's hard to imagine, but follow with me. So you walk in and you see chaos. These boys, they just dropped their bags in the middle of the floor. They're throwing pillows and bags at each other. They're, doing wrestling moves on the mattresses, and they're screaming. And so this counselor walks in, and you're like, okay, this is what they just trained me for. I just did several hours of training for this. I've got to come in with discipline and set things off right, so we can have a good week. And then I can ease up a little bit as the week goes on. But I got to start out strong. So he walks in, he goes, guys, you heard the rules. You're not following the rules. Get your stuff now. Grab it. Put it under the beds. Get your swimsuits on and get out ready for your test. Move. Now, here's what can often happen. Now, in the Midwest, we have a lot of, different areas. You got kids from the inner city of Chicago or Milwaukee, but you also have kids from Duluth and Appleton and, these little towns. And so they come together at camp. And so when a counselor will shout out and yell these instructions, you'll get some of the, maybe a white kid from Appleton will be like, oh, I'm sorry. And he'll grab his bag and run over and be like, okay, here you go. And stand like this. But the kids from the south side of Chicago are like, hold up. Who are you talking to? Right? Now we have a potential conflict. So the counselor will go, oh, I can't let this happen. This could be mutiny. And he'll walk over and be like, do not disrespect me. Follow instructions. I told you what to do. Grab your bags. Do it now. Move. And these kids from Chicago are going to be like, dude, I don't know you. You don't just come at me like that. So now what's going through this counselor's mind? Oh, we got some rebellious ones over here. I got my eyes on you. And conflict has already started, right? And now the next day, you're down at the playground area. And you've got, some of the kids are over playing volleyball and 9 square and doing these things. But then you get this group, the same kids from Chicago. They're playing basketball. Come on, that's what you do in the Chi-Town, right? You playing basketball. And they're talking smack to each other. And they're like, dude, you ain't got game. I'm the clamp god. I'm this, and they're talking back and forth. And the counselor's like, fellas, hey, this is church camp. We don't talk to each other like that here. We got to be encouraging. And so they're like, what's with this dude? Like, we're not doing anything wrong, dude. Why don't you go off somewhere? And now you start to get conflict that goes on throughout the week, and it continues. And it's not very long before, by Wednesday or Thursday, these kids start to go, I know what the problem is. Dude is always on us, and I know what the problem is. He's racist. And this camp counselor would go, if he heard that, he would go, what? No. You just weren't following what you're supposed to be doing. And see, we have a conflict there, but what it is it's a cultural conflict. It's differing cultures that masks itself or connects itself with the historic problems of race, and now we think we have a race problem when it's actually just a cultural misunderstanding. And so, for example, my wife and I learned that as we've gone throughout our years together. We've been married over 20 years now. And we've had a great adventure in cross-cultural adventures, right? And so one of the things is, and we would take things very differently, whether it was current events or things in the church or whatever, is I was raised with a background from a culture that you just accepted authority. If someone came in with a certain position of authority shouting instructions at me, I just did it. There was no question. My dad raised us with the saying, when I say jump, you say, aye. You would think that's what he said, but that's not what he said. It's a whole nother level. He would say, when I say jump, you say, when can I come down, sir? See how that's a whole nother level right there, right? Now my wife came from a background, sort of her cultural background and story was you didn't just, it wasn't safe to just trust authority figures. That didn't always go well for her folks. You didn't come at folks like that. The authority is viewed in a different sort of way, right? And we get these in the church. We get these cultural problems and backgrounds. So at the beginning here, let me say, why talk about culture and race? The minute you bring that up, and we're going to talk about culture and race, I'm betting some of you got nervous. Like, whoa, why are we having that? Whoa, what do we need to talk about that for, right? And we get these questions. Is this going to be a minefield? This is going to be divisive. Aren't we making... we're taking a gospel issue and turning it into a race issue. I got to hear this all the time on the news. And now at church events, we got to talk about race and culture as well. And so some of those things can go through our minds. So let me just address that right up front. First of all, healthy families talk. Right? So imagine a scenario in which a husband was, mowing the lawn or doing whatever, and his wife comes up to him and says, we got to talk about some things in our marriage. There's some things we got to work on. Some things I'd like to discuss. And that husband goes, no, stop right there, woman. Let me help you out. The Bible says that the two become one flesh. We are one. We are united. We are good. We don't need to talk about these things. So just step back with your divisive talk that is going to cause a problem in our marriage where there is none, and let's just move on and be happy together. Interestingly, that's the topic of the upcoming marriage retreat in the Heartland. Is we are one, so shut up and let's move on. No, you know instinctively that's like danger, right? If there's a young husband that said something like that, all the older guys would be like, dude, we'll plan your funeral for you. In fact, if you're in a relationship like a marriage, and there are things you can't talk about, those are the areas where your relationship is the weakest and most vulnerable. A strong relationship is able to talk about difficult things. And if you think about your marriage, sometimes the most challenging, painful conversations are also the fertile ground for the most growth. Right? So I'm not saying all these conversations will be easy or even painless, but they are necessary. Healthy families talk. It is God's plan for us to be a family of all nations. Now, in some respects, in our family churches, we got here sort of accidentally. If you talk to the old guys, it's like, man, we were just sharing our faith, and we turned around, and there was people of all types, and look what God did. Nobody really had a plan. But it was always God's plan, going all the way back to Abraham, and we'll see that today. He said, you're going to have a family of all nations. And Jesus said, go to all the nations and make disciples. And Paul was very protective of it. But here's the reality. The more different we are, the harder it will be to be family. We have different backgrounds, cultures, perspectives, histories, and so it does make it more challenging. It would be a lot easier for me, on many respects, to be in a church of middle-aged, middle-class, white guys from the Midwest. They get me. We just got more in common. It's easier to get along. But that's not God's plan, and it would not demonstrate the wisdom of who God wants us to be. I think it's a great strength of our movement, and we should be proud of what God has done, that we are a family of all nations. We don't want to turn a strength into weakness, right? And when we understand that the gospel is about this reconciliation of all human beings to one family, we realize that this is not a side issue that we talk about and then move on. It's at the very heart of what the gospel is. And so if we are called to be this family of all nations, think about it. Imagine a church that was 60% even married folks that never talked about marriage, never did lessons on marriage, never did marriage retreats, never taught the singles about how to be married, any of that, that would be problematic, wouldn't it? And yet, here we are, this grand experiment of a family of all nations, all cultures, all groups, and we almost never talk about things like cross-cultural communication. That's not good. That's a recipe for misunderstanding. Right? Revelation 5:9 says, with Jesus' blood, he purchased persons from every tribe and language and people and nation. That's who we are. That's the target we're aiming for, but it's going to take work. Now let me talk about culture here briefly. Culture is a learned system of knowledge and behavioral patterns shared by a certain group of people. In other words, it's a way of life to which a particular society adheres. And here's the powerful thing about culture. You almost never know you're learning it. No one overtly teaches it to you. You just breathe it in. And it is what, and this is a very powerful word, it is what becomes normal to you, right? What's normal about how to interact with people? That's culture. Culture teaches it to you. How close do you stand to people when you talk to them? Are you this far away or are you this far away? Right? As soon as I get into airports outside of the U.S., that's always a thing. You know, people are like right here. And I'm like, you know, I'm sorry, did you not see my American passport? I get a 3-foot bubble. Because we like our personal space. It's how you talk. It's what you consider family. We had a situation recently where we were having a really good discussion in Minneapolis. And a young black single sister said she had become a disciple. And she said, you know, when I first came to the church, it was really hard because it didn't feel like family. And we're like, oh, okay, that's interesting. What gave you that feeling? And she said, well, the first several weeks I came out to church, a married couple like took me out to lunch every day. Like after church, they kept taking me out to lunch. And it's like, okay, explain. And she goes, well, you have family in your home. And so from her culture, there was this different understanding of family, right? And so even things like that can lead to, you've got a portion of the church that will go, this is a family, man. We're like a family. And then you got other folks in the church going, this ain't like family. This doesn't feel like family. Because even that, your idea of what family is, of how relationships should work, all these things are influenced by our culture. Is it respectful to look somebody in the eye when talking to them? Or is that disrespectful? You know, all of these things. Do you say something directly to somebody, or do you kind of move around a little bit and hint at it more? All these things are from culture. There are a lot of influences of culture. There's media and experiences and tradition and religion and all these things that can influence our culture. But there are two main levels of culture that I think it's helpful to understand. One is the objective, that's above the surface. These are the things that you see easily. How you greet each other, food, clothing, that sort of thing. We have a culture in our church. How do you greet somebody in our family of churches? You hug them, right? You better, I'm trying to talk Casey here into getting a tattoo across his chest that says hug life, you know. I think he's going for it. Yeah. But the things you see, you know, your music, the orientation of time, those things, those are above the surface and they're obvious. But even more powerful are these subjective, below the surface ideas, cultural values and beliefs that are invisible, but they're there. What do you value? What do you think about authority? What do you think about gender roles? We were having this conversation recently with a couple it's an African brother that's getting married to an American girl, and it's like, y'all better have a real conversation about gender expectations and roles, because they're going to be very different. You get married and all of a sudden it kicks in, well, my culture says, here's what a wife should be. And we don't talk about these expectations. Does that make sense? I'm going to have my wife come up and she's going to tell a little story about culture, and I'll just let her tell it. There you go.
Hi there. All right, so the story that I want to share is one that came about in my line of work. I'm a critical care nurse, and where I work, we have this role called the critical care flyer. So basically what you do is anywhere somebody has a need in the hospital, like you go and you help them. So one day I was just coming on work, had just got all my pager and everything settled, and overhead page came over. It said code green, room, or by the 5th floor elevators. And in our hospital, I don't know if you guys have this out here, but a code green basically means something is going down in the hospital somewhere and they need some help, like right away. So I kind of ran up to the elevator, came off the elevator, and I saw just this like mob of people. There were a couple of security officers, there were a couple of nurses, and then there was the patient. He was trying to get on the elevator so he could go downstairs and get him something to eat, and couldn't understand why all these people were trying to keep them from doing it and why they had to call the police, right? So he was delirious, which meant that he didn't really understand he was in the hospital. And so the nurses were afraid and felt like they couldn't manage the situation, so they called security. So they had a wheelchair, and I said, hey, because I had met him a couple days prior and sat with him for a little bit. So I said, hey, hey man, why don't you, I said, come on over here and have a seat. Come on, let me help you over here. He was like, well, I'm hungry, I'm trying to go get me something to eat. So one of the nurses offered him spaghetti. She's like, I have spaghetti and meatballs, I'll get that together. I said, now she said she has some food for you. Come on, let me help you get back to the room. I'm worried about you. So we all, he got in the wheelchair, I pushed him back to the room. The security guards followed us with their cuffs and, tasers and all this stuff, right? Because that's what guards have. So anyhow, we get back into the room and we're sitting there, and he could hear their radios going off in the hallway. So he was like, let me go out here and see what's going on. They got 5 all posted upside my door. Like, why are they here? And so he kind of got up out of the chair, staggered to the door, and went out there and started talking to them. He's pretty escalated. And I went with him. He said his piece. We came back into the room. And in the meantime, the nurse had brought the spaghetti. So he sat there. As we're sitting there, he's going on and on about the situation and what happened. So I have my phone with me. Generally, we're not supposed to carry our phones, but I just happened to have it with me that day. And I turned on Pandora. I turned on what I love, 70s and 80s R&B. So we listened to some Luther. We listened to some Aretha. And I noticed his whole demeanor started to, and the Isley Brothers, can't forget them. We even listened to a little Rick and Tina, okay? So as we're listening to this music, I noticed his foot. He started tapping his foot, and he's eating his food. I was like, man, I said, you don't know nothing about that. He said, baby, I wrote that music. I said, okay. I said, well, tell me what you know. So he started to sing, right? So as he's sitting there eating, singing, we're talking back and forth. And I said, man, are you tired? I said, I know, I'm tired of looking at you. Ain't you ready to go to bed? And so he said, well, can you help me get to bed? And so I helped him to get to bed. And after we got him to bed, I went back out and I talked to, the other nurses, because we usually try to do a debriefing or whatever, just check in. And what I took away from the situation was they called security because they were afraid. They didn't know what to do in the situation. And security responded, the way that security responds, And so with this older African-American man, he was also afraid. There was fear. So that produced a response in him, that required security to come. My point in sharing this, and the reason that I think it's totally applicable to what we're learning about, is I feel like a lot of times, even though, we all come through the waters of baptism, we are all cleansed and purified and perfected by the blood of Jesus, we still have a lot of that stuff here. Fear. We don't really know about one another. We don't know the roads and the journeys that God has brought each of us through. And sometimes that can produce a fear. So I guess my encouragement is to get to know one another, to get to know one another's stories, because I think that can help us to have a context. And then also, sometimes we might have to shout code green, for help, and get somebody into situations that are, it doesn't even have to be a situation, but just get someone that may be able to identify and to relate to help us to understand each other's language that we're speaking or culture.
Thank you. And the story really illustrates the power of being able to connect with somebody at a cultural level and understand just little things about that. And I think it's my wife's ability to do that. And I got to tell you that she was last year named one of the top 100 nurses in the nation. And every time I say that, she hates it, and I pay for that later. Still worth it, though. Yeah. Now, here's the thing. Culture can be at all sorts of levels. Countries have cultures. If you don't think so, if you've never traveled out of the United States, I encourage you to. If you spend 6 or 8 weeks outside the U.S. and you come back in and you'll be like, whoa, we're sort of aggressive and a little bit obnoxious at times. And it's just, and very, adamant about everything. And that's just kind of the way it is. Even in the Midwest, where we feel like, no, we're laid back. It's like, no, Countries have cultures. Regions have cultures. We were just in Texas a couple weeks ago, so that's a different country. And very different culture, right? You're from Texas, different culture. Cities have cultures, churches have cultures, even households have cultures. Right? You can grow up in a house right next door to somebody and have very different, there's a lot of cultural things in common, but there are different cultural things. And that's the reality. So the broader we take the gospel, the more cultures we're going to come in contact with. And so the more work that's going to need to be done. In 1 Corinthians 9, Paul addresses this topic, and it's really central for him. And he says, this is a passage, I won't read the whole passage, but he says, to the Jews I became like the Jews, and to this group I became like this group. And ultimately he says, I've become all things to all people, so that I might save some. And this is the ethic he wants the Corinthian church and all the churches to embrace. Paul is not talking about changing the message of the gospel. He's talking about adjusting himself. He's talking about culture here. He's saying, I learn what you value and what things work with you and what your culture is. And I bend myself. So he's being a student here. He's learning the cultures. He's understanding other cultures. And he's adapting himself. And he wants them to set this up as sort of the underlying ethos of their community. When we become a community where we're all willing to learn and bend and grow and change, then it starts to work. But if we get locked into, this is just what's normal. Why are you doing it weird? That's when we start to have trouble, okay? Now, culture and ethnicity, believe it or not, was quite arguably the primary source of conflict in the early church. It's all throughout the New Testament. When people go, I don't want to talk, why do we have to talk about culture and ethnicity and things like that? It's like, well, you must not read the New Testament very often then. Because it's all throughout there. You have, and these are just a few. You have in Acts the Hebraic Jews and the Hellenic Jews. You have the Jews and the Gentiles throughout the book of Acts. You have Jew having sort of the upper hand over the Gentiles in Galatia. Paul has to address that. He writes the letter of Galatians to address this cultural conflict they were having. In Romans, it's the same conflict, but it's the flip. This time it seems like the Gentiles have kind of the upper hand. And so it's a cross-cultural ministry training book. You see it there's Corinth, there's Ephesus, there's place after place after place where he's dealing with these conflicts. So that's encouraging in one sense, but it's also sobering in the fact that it reminds us that we're never going to be done doing this work. It never ends. This conversation will never end. It's very similar to marriage. You don't go, we put in the first 7 years were tough, but then we figured it out and now we've got it down. It's just easy. We haven't had to work in our marriage for 20 years. It does not work that way, right? Or I don't know. Maybe it does for Kevin and Kim. I don't know. Maybe they've got that down. But you have to keep working it, okay? And think of, for example, this conflict in Acts 6 between the Hebraic and the Hellenic Jews. Now, if you read that text, it starts out in chapter 6 and it says the word of God was spreading. And then it's like somebody slams on the brakes. It was spreading, but the Hellenic Jews started to feel like they were being marginalized. And a conflict arises. And they bring it up and they say, hey, here's the deal. And I won't go into it all here, but the situation is resolved quickly. But imagine if the apostles had not dealt with it. Imagine the sort of thoughts they could have had. What if the kingdom isn't different after all? That's one of the main fears that people have, is that the sin and division and prejudice of the world is going to come into our beloved church. And some people are panicked by that. And that's what causes some of the visceral responses and anger. And it's like, bro, why are you so angry about this? Right? And it's because, well, it's more fear that that's going to come into the church. What if the leaders are showing favoritism? What if they're trying to neglect and marginalize us, just like happens in the world? Oh, I see what's going on here. Right? These guys don't really love us. They're bigoted. They can't keep treating us like this. They don't understand that, you know what? We should just go start our own church. These are the sort of thought process that you can go down if these things aren't talked about and dealt with. There are three aspects to culture, I think, that come into play as in context of the kingdom of God. Number one, we see in Romans 12. Do not conform to the patterns of this world. There are things about our culture that when we become disciples, we say, you know what, I gotta change that. I gotta leave that aspect of my culture behind. It's not okay. There are literally cultures where it's acceptable to lie. That you can't do that in God's kingdom, right? But there are aspects we leave behind. Then he talks about being transformed by the renewing of your mind. There are some aspects where as we become a Christian, we're all going to come together and create a new culture. We're going to be transformed. We're going to create a kingdom culture. And that's ultimately what we're after. But then there's a third category. This is what Paul's talking about in 1 Corinthians 9, where we seek to appreciate and embrace the cultural expressions of other people. And we've got to understand, as typically speaking as Americans, we are not very good at embracing the cultural expressions of other people. We're just not. That's part of our culture. There's an American way, and you should do it my way, and it's normal. And you look at the way other people are dressed, or the way they communicate, or the way they interact, or the values they have, and you go, that's weird. Well, no, and this is one of the big things we have to embrace. We have a way of doing things, but it's not the way, right? And we don't even question it sometimes. I was in an airport a few years back, and I was waiting for a plane, and everyone was sitting there, and I was too, and you know how they have, it was in Johannesburg, and they have these, what are those called? Armrests, kind of in there. And people are trying to get around them and get comfortable and sort of, work around and lay down, and it was just miserable. And so after a while, I was like, forget this, and I'm just going to walk through the airport. And so I'm walking up and down, and I walked by this gate, and I noticed there was a plane going to Beijing, I believe. And it was mostly Chinese travelers, and I looked, and they're all laid out on the floor just dead asleep as the day is long. Looking comfortable, and I was a little bitter, and I'm like, look at them all sleeping. And then I was like, why is that? Because without even realizing it, we have been trained by our culture to believe that the floor is dirty. So without even thinking about it, I'm willing to put my face where somebody's stuff just was, and I'm just fine, like, why? Because my culture tells me that's okay, but that's not. And so we didn't even think about it. People walk by and be like, ooh, that's weird, they're all sleeping on the floor. Right? Now, some of us might go, that's actually a pretty good idea. I don't know why I didn't think of that. But that's the power of culture. Let's skip through here. Oh, we got an old version. That's okay. We'll figure that out later. Let's talk about dominant and non-dominant cultures. And this becomes important within the kingdom of God, okay? And there's some characteristics here. Dominant cultures tend to be unaware of their own culture. Now, with any group, there tends to be a cultural group that is dominant. And that's not bad, it just is what it is, okay? And it can be different, but you can usually look and say, okay, this is kind of the dominant cultural group in this particular church or this particular region or whatever. And one of the privileges of being of the dominant culture is that you're unaware that you have culture. I see Americans do that a lot. We don't have a culture in America. Yeah, oh, yes, we do. Or I've heard people be like, well, I don't think we really have a culture in our church. We just follow the Bible. Of course we have a culture. Go to a Korean church, go to a black church, go to an African church, and you will see a very different culture, right? And so there's a reality that there's a dominant group and a non-dominant group, and we tend to be unaware of our own culture. That can become problematic. It's not necessarily wrong until you become aware of it, and then if you refuse to become aware of others' cultures. The non-dominant groups are very typically aware of their own culture as well as that of the dominant group. You just have to operate. That's just the natural law of things, right? You know your own culture, but you're around the larger culture, and so you understand their culture a little bit better than they're going to understand yours. That's a reality. Now, here's how this plays out practically, and again, I exaggerate a little bit, but it's true and it makes a point, is, where we come from in the upper Midwest, for example, the singing tends to be a little more on the, shall we say, stiff side, okay? And you kind of, everybody's like, I'm right here. And, we might get really wild and clap and like that, right? But you go to West Africa, and you'll come into a church in West Africa, and you'll have a stage here, and then the first row will be back about 40 feet. And you're like, why is there such a space between the first row and the stage? Oh, because they're going to need that area. As soon as the music starts, people start coming down the aisles, and they're like, and it's a whole body experience. And me and my son this last summer, we were in Cameroon, and they started to have a dance circle during the worship service. And we're going around, and they're like, I like your funny English dancing. It's like, am I dancing in English too? That's when you know you don't have rhythm, is when you're dancing in English. But here's what happens. Sometimes we'll come back and try to bring that, like, hey, let's do this song and let's cut loose like this in the Midwest, in Minnesota. And we'll get brothers and sisters that are like, oh, I long for that. But then the dominant culture can be like, oh, no. Well, I don't know why you're trying to make me do that. That's very uncomfortable. That's like, it's weird. It's outside of my comfort zone. Like, that's not fair to ask me to do that. I mean, you can do it if you want, but why do I have to? And they don't stop to think that I'm making you play by my cultural expectations and values all the time. But I'm not willing to now step out of my comfort zone and get uncomfortable and join into you. So it's not really enough to say, well, you go ahead and do that, and I'll just stand here like this. It's very discouraging. It says you don't value what I value. And that's the opposite of what Paul is trying to teach here in 1 Corinthians 9, is to be all things to all people. Now, I can let loose. I can't have rhythm. I can't get that far. But I can dance with you. I can sing with you. Right? And there's some controversy in our household over this, but basically my wife has banned me from dancing in public. But she claims that's not true, but it is. Because of this, so the non-dominant group tends to be more adept at adopting to the ways of the dominant group than vice versa. the dominant group, because they're more unfamiliar with the non-dominant group, are quicker to grow upset and offended when they're asked to step outside of their norms or to do things the way the non-dominant group. So I'm not demonizing here. We're doing none of that today. We're not putting all the responsibility on one group or the dominant group. But we are saying that there is a certain, I think, responsibility of the dominant group to say, man, we really got to self-assess here. Do we sort of make other people do it our way without meaning to? But non-dominant groups can have their own things. They can sort of culture cluster up at times. They can grow impatient or ungodly. So that, it's all across the board. But we've got to, when we're all willing to become all things to all people, it starts to work. But when we're not, there can become a growing but quiet discontent on the part of the non-dominant culture. Why are we always the one that got to change? Why are we always doing it? Why do we always have to give it? Those sorts of thoughts. And so it can become a problem for a church culture if we don't check our ethnocentrism at the door. Ethnocentrism is simply where you think your way of doing things is the best way. Me and my wife have had epic ethnocentric clashes. Because we'll do things and she'll be like, okay. And can I be blunt and honest? We just have these conversations. She'll come in, she'll be like, why do white people do this? And I'll be like, okay, this is why. And she's like, that's just wrong. That's just the wrong way to do it. And I'm like, no, it's not. It's a way. Remember we teach that? It's a way, not the way. And she's like, well, it's a way, but it's a wrong way. So, there's a certain thing where we're going to, kind of like the way we do it. We had clashes when we were first married. She would come and ask me, she'd just be like, can you scratch my back? And I'd be like, and I'm thinking, my wife is so rude. You don't just ask somebody straight out for something. Now you've socially obligated me to say, yes, I have no out. You ask me directly. Now the proper way to do it would be the way I do it, which is say my neck's hurting and I want her to rub it. I'll be like, oh, my neck is killing me today. Now see, that's a proper request because I've put it out there gently so that you can either accept or decline the request with no face being lost by anybody. So for years I'm like, my wife is rude. And we have conflicts like this in the church where people do stuff and you're like, they're just rude. They're spiritual. They're obnoxious. I guarantee you, I don't think any disciple gets up in the morning and goes, I wonder how I can be rude today in church. I've got it. Nobody does that, right? And so what I've learned over the years is to say, hon, what did you mean by that? Because it felt rude. It didn't feel right. And to be able to interpret what the action would mean in her culture, not what it would mean if I was doing it. Does that make sense? That's a really important metric. We'll talk about that again in a minute. What we want in a church is we're going after multiculturalism. Now I know that's sort of a buzzword, and it's like, we're not talking about the world's version of multiculturalism. We're talking about God's version of all things to all people for the sake of the gospel and the family of all nations. Not assimilation. Assimilation, if you're an old Star Trek fan in the Borg, that's where you will become one of us sort of thing. We're talking about accommodation where everybody's culture is invited. We want your expressions. Teach us. Show us. I'll get out of my comfort zone. I'll do it. I'll listen. If you say we're always doing it one way, okay, show us another way. Let's do it. I don't have to be defensive about it. Let's become this community where everybody can express themselves versus you must become like us. That's assimilation. And that's not what Paul is talking about. He doesn't say, we want to call all people so they can come in and be like us. He says, I become all things to all people. And I bring them in. We can culture clash over all kinds of things. Music, communication, views of time. Do you focus on a task or a relationship? Collective versus individual, authority, family structure, weddings and funerals. Oh Lord, weddings and funerals. Growing up for me, funerals were sort of a more private thing. It's just for the immediate family. If somebody in my family dies, I don't need y'all there. It's fine. I love you. I know you're my brothers and sisters in Christ. It's good. I'm gonna go over here and do this. In my wife's culture, we go to every doggone funeral in the world. Because she'll be like, well, so we got this funeral this weekend. Who died? Well, my granddaddy's brothers, nieces, cousins, something or other. And I'm like, what? She's like, yeah, that family. How's that family? But it is, and everybody, she's like, yeah, and everybody should come. I guarantee you, if she even sort of knows you, and you have somebody in your family die, my wife's going to show up at your funeral. Because that's the culture, right? And so we can clap, but people can get their feelings hurt in the body over that. Well, they didn't come to my family's funeral. And I'm thinking, like, well, it'd be disrespectful to come to your grandma's funeral or something. So we've got to learn, right? And we've got to be able to express and say, it hurt my feelings that you didn't come to that funeral. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know that I should have. And understand that it's culture. It's not a lack of spiritualism. It's not that you didn't love me. It's not racial. It's not these things. Those things can all happen, but a lot of it is culture. And it's not just ethnicity, right? Let's say John Mantle and I get in a discipling relationship. And John comes from a background where he's a very direct communicator. And he just says it bluntly like it is. And if you're in sin, I'll tell you you're in sin, and I'll tell you where you got to change, and that's loving. But for me, I come from a background where, it's more indirect communication. You don't just say things straight out. That's a little offensive and aggressive. And so now we sit down for discipling time, and John's like, okay, I got a list of 3 things here that I saw in your life, bro. You need to change. You need to work on this and this and this. You're welcome. And I walk away going, John is unspiritual and unloving. I can't be in a relationship with this guy. And what it actually is a misunderstanding of cultural communication styles. Where if I just had the ability to go, that felt really aggressive and rude. Did you mean to be that way? No, I'm just trying to be direct and honest. And then you can start to communicate, right? And recognize these things for what they are. Does that make sense? But that has nothing to do with race. That could be guys of the same race. Grow up in the same area. Now, here's one example, and we'll give a couple quick examples here. Views of time. There's 2 main cultures. There's monochronic and polychronic. Now, monochronic sees time as a limited commodity. It's here, it's gone, time's a wasting, don't waste time, no time like the present. Let's go, time is money. If you say things like that, you're probably monochronic. You have a schedule, you like to be on time, you like to move, you don't like changes to the schedule, you don't like interruptions, you don't like that. If the Christmas party, like my family, starts at 4, it's going to start at 4. Food at 4:30, children's activities at 5, gift opening at 6, we're done at 6:30, see you next year. Polychronic cultures see time as cyclical. There's plenty of time. Comes around, goes around. Why do today what you can do tomorrow? Now, in these true polychronic cultures, the value is not on time, it's on relationship. So it's just viewing a different thing. And monochronic people will look and go, those people are undisciplined, and don't you respect my time? And don't you see, my time is valuable? And to them, it's like, there's all kinds of time. We got later or tomorrow or whatever. We're talking relationship here. And we would go to her family parties for like Thanksgiving lunch, and we'd get there at 11, and they ain't even starting to cook the food till 1:30. And you'd be like, I'm starving, and at 4:30 or 5, it's like, when are we gonna eat? And she's like, well, we're just waiting on Juicy to put the cornbread in, and I'm like, what? But here's where it can get real, though. Here's where it can get real. In the community, I would start going, when is this going to be over? You know, my family parties, they're done at 6:30. I got plans here. I got things to do. I made plans. We should be hitting the road. We should be home by 10, and then I've got things to do. But she starts to go, do you not like my family? Now, I've joked that when we have functions with her family, I just bring snacks and we figure it out. But now, based on that, how many of you say, I think I'm probably more monochronic? Okay? How many of you say, I think I'm polychronic? Your church family together. Good luck. We have clashes all the time over time. It's like, oh, and I try to remind her, I'm like, please, the airlines are not polychronic. They don't play that game. They gotta... There's also, and I'll just do this one quickly. This is often, sociologists say, this is based less on race, although somewhat, but more on whether you grew up in generational poverty or in the middle class. But those that grew up in generational poverty tend to communicate in a style that's called casual or spiral communication. And those who grew up more in the middle class tend towards linear communication. Now, linear communicators it's a very logical form of communicating. I start at the beginning and I go A, B, C, D, and now we're done. Spiral communicators, it's more about entertainment. It's more about interaction. You start sort of in the middle and you start winding your story around. Okay? And what happens when these two interact is, you know, this person, and I'll be honest, my wife tends to be more of a spiral communicator. I'm linear. You could probably guess that by everything else we've said. And they'll start stories like in the middle, and then you're sitting there and I'm like, get to the point. Just, do you not want to hear what I'm saying? No, I do. That's why I want you to get to the point. It makes no sense. And she'll start, you know, she'll just throw out some random statement. I'm like, what? How does that make sense? Right? We're driving the other day, a few months ago, and she goes, we were in North Carolina for a workshop, and she goes, oh, we're going to have lunch with Chris and Lucy because my brother can't make it. Her brother lives in South Carolina. I'm like, well, what are you talking about? Well, he has a class today, so he can't make it. A class for what? What? Well, as it turns out, she had invited her brother to come over to the workshop, but he had a class in South Carolina that day, could not make it. So therefore, because we had that time free for lunch that was going to be with him, she then contacted our old friends Chris and Lucy and said, if you're going to be at the workshop, why don't we have lunch? And therefore, we have lunch plans with Chris and Lucy because her brother couldn't make it. I've learned now when she starts telling a story, I'm just going to settle in, and this will make sense at some point. But we're a mix of this in our bodies, right? And so and people start talking, it's like, what do you, just get to the point. Or you'll talk with somebody for 10 minutes and walk away and be like, I have no idea what we just talked about. I don't know. And you've got to be able to communicate through that and figure that out. Sociologists say that it's easier for these folks to figure out how to communicate at this level than vice versa. Because this is an art. It's not a science. 1 Corinthians 9, Paul says This is right after he says we become all things to all people. We often forget the context of this passage. Right after that, he says, don't you know that this is going to be really hard and take training and a lot of hard work? It will be hard. It will be difficult. Being these cross-cultural ministers is a challenge. But here's a warning. Unchecked cultural superiority or dominance and indifference to these issues can start to walk and quack like prejudice in the eyes of others. If you start to not care about the cultures of others, it starts to look like you're prejudiced. We want to be Revelation 5 focused, not on who we are, but on who God wants us to be as a family of all nations. Everybody should walk in and see that this is our central commitment. There's a place for you. You're welcome. We want to learn about your culture. We want you to feel welcome. We want you to be able to express yourself. And not just that, we'll join in with you. And when we're all doing that, community starts to work. At the end of this session here, I just want to do this quickly. A cross-cultural church will value diversity. It will self-assess culturally. It will become aware of how these things matter. It will incorporate cultural understanding into the life of the church and be willing to modify where we need to. And there needs to be a great deal of patience with this. It takes time. It takes work. It's not easy. I'm not going to go over these today. These are some cross-cultural principles from the book of Romans in chapter 14. If you want to go into those more, you have to go over and get a copy of the book, Crossing the Line, Culture, Race, and Kingdom. And all this stuff is in there and a whole lot more. And we'll talk about it a little more in the next session. But I will say one thing that we hadn't planned on this, but that a lot of people have done is said, man, I went and I bought like 5, 6, 7 copies, and I went around to my neighbors, and I invited them to a book discussion group in my neighborhood, and it worked. We're having great discussions. They started coming out to church. That's not a normal thing you would think of, like, hey, let's go ask our neighbors to a discussion on race and culture. That's usually, you would run away from that, like, you know. So something to think about. Cross-cultural values. These are important. Give the benefit of the doubt. If somebody does something that rubs you the wrong way, what if you assume they had the best in mind, but there's a cultural misunderstanding? Look for what the action means in their culture. Now, it'll probably never feel right. Some of the things that my wife does still feels rude to me in the moment. But I've learned how to translate it. And that helps a ton to say, you know what, she means to be respectful. It's still wrong, but she means to be respectful. Allow each other to make mistakes. Be sensitive to others. Don't be so sensitive to yourself. We're doing that, it works. Reserve judgment. Don't assume that your point of view is normal or correct. Be proactive. Get out of your comfort zone. Being all things to all people demands that we get out of our comfort zone. And finally here, relax. Have fun with it. We laugh about it. I know we can get uptight about these things, but relax. 5 important questions here. What are my cultural beliefs or behaviors? Does the Bible call me to a new way of thinking or behaving about my beliefs and behaviors? What are your beliefs and cultural behaviors? And does the Bible call me to a new way of thinking about your beliefs and behaviors? Not does the Bible call you to a new way. That's for you to work out. Does the Bible call me to think differently about your behaviors? And the most important question maybe we can ask, as I mentioned earlier, what did you mean by that? And we've got to become a community where it's okay to ask that. And there's not offense at it. Did you mean to be this? No. Culture? It got us again. You can start to have fun with it. Oh. Your culture is crazy. Above all, love each other. Because deeply, I forgot that word. Love each other deeply. Because it covers over a multitude of sins. I'll end with this. We're given a cross-cultural mission. That means that, just to summarize, Jesus commanded us to go to all people groups. to all nations. God's family will consist of every tribe, language, people, group, and nation, thus every culture. And that means we will have to be all things to all people to make this work. Amen. We're going to go take a little break. My wife is over there. If you want to get a book, that'd be great. We encourage it. It helps us out. But it's also, you can do cash. You can do credit, all of that. The pays and all those things. You can do check. You can just make it out to me. And it's one book for 15 and two for 25. So we'll take a break and we'll come back with a second session, race and culture.